You know, in many respects, we have to thank our ancestors for giving us models of leadership because when we really think and look at the generation we live in, it's scary to think about what leadership and paradigms of leadership that exist today, as well as the paradigms of leadership of tomorrow. And in certain respects, when we think about our youth and when they look at presidential elections and campaigns and how the people who are rising up to leadership positions and how they get there, or when we hear about fallen leaders and how they come to these really complex and very intense social issues in which sometimes people get wrapped up in, we have to ask the question: what is a model for sustainable leadership? And on some level, we know that the two leaders that feature deeply in this week's Torah portion, amongst others, are Moshe and Yitro. And these two different paradigms of leadership are actually one and the same, and in many ways very different. And one way to really encapsulate that is actually a story that the Midrash, the rabbis, write that Moses, as an outlaw, was actually, when he met Yitro, Yitro was actually wary of accepting Moses into his home and to marry his daughter Tzipporah, because Moshe was an outlaw and so was Yitro. They both fought back against the institution of Pharaoh, and they both came to their own higher selves and recognition. We know that Yitro is called Kohen Midyan. He is a priest. He is someone who is elevated in his stature. Eventually, Moses becomes Ish Elohim, the man of God, and they both rise, but they don't start that way. And Yitro was actually wary of Moses just because if there were two outlaws of Pharaoh in one city, what could that mean? What would that potentially rise as issues? And we see, though, that eventually the partnership that Yitro and Moshe form ends up becoming the bedrock not only of everything that is to come in the Torah narratives when it comes to Moshe and his organizing skills and in terms of receiving the Ten Commandments as we receive in this week's Torah portion, but we see that Moshe is trying to handle so much of the nation on his own, and that really, as much as Moses stayed in the home of Yitro and in the fields of Yitro and being Roeh Tzo and being a shepherd of Yitro for so many years, and in many ways that set up a foundation to empower him to think deeper about what it might mean to go to Pharaoh. We see a new stage, the new stage set. We see that the splitting sea has taken place, and right before receiving the Torah, we see that Moses is on his own judging the people. And when Yitro sees an entire nation, how many? At least 6 or 7 million, according to Rashi's calculations, of people who are all being stewarded and helped by one mentor, all being helped by just Moses. Really, as we celebrate the legacy of Dr. King last week, was it really just Martin who carried the civil rights era? Yes, a leader, but was it really just one person? And we see that Moshe somewhat siloed himself to being one voice for an entire nation. And we see that sometimes people see themselves or establishments and roots of communities, movements, seeing their voice as being the quintessential ultimate voice. And we see that in this week's Torah portion, that actually when Yitro comes to Moshe and he sees what he's doing, he says, Lo tov hadavar hazeh, this isn't good what you are doing. Distributed leadership is actually important. And so Yitro suggests to Moshe to take on the voice of delegation, to build up what leadership should look like, and to form relationships with those who might be different than you, but who ultimately share values and principles that are oriented similarly. So what might that mean? Someone, as Yitro says, people who are honest, people who have the ability to stand in strength, people who are a part of this Mamlecha Kohanim, as we see in this week's Torah portion, the kingdom of priests, this kingdom of royal people who raise the roof and have elevated spirits. And so the weekly mission for this week, and something to think about for all of us, is that as we continue into the next generation, really asking the question of, what does sustainable leadership actually look like? And as we see from Moshe's model, if without the intervention of Yitro, what would it look like? Would we have had the leaders of tens and leaders of thousands, of hundreds and thousands? Would we have a way of making a sustainable model of leadership for the Jewish community? And what do we need to do in our generation to make sure that our leadership and our communities are sustainable equally? Shabbat Shalom.